Well, tell you what you're going to find, but find it for yourself. That tells us a lot about the war against terrorism and about ourselves. After the United States took over the country again under the conditions that were so graphically described by the press, the country is it was pretty much destroyed in the 1980s, but it's totally collapsed since. In every respect, just about economically, it's declined sharply since the U.S. takeover, democratically in every other respect. It's now the second poorest country in the hemisphere. I should say, I'm not going to talk about it, but I mentioned that I picked up Nicaragua because it's an uncontroversial case. If you look at the other states in the region, the state terror was far more extreme. And it again traces back to Washington, and that's by no means all. It was happening elsewhere in the world too. So if, take, say, Africa, during the Reagan years alone, South African attacks backed by the United States and Britain, South African, U.S., UK-backed South African attacks against the neighboring countries killed about 1.5 million people and left $60 billion of damage and countries destroyed. And if we go around the world, we can add more examples. That was the war, the first war against terror, of which I've given a small sample. Are we supposed to pay attention to that or kind of think that that might be relevant? After all, it's not exactly ancient history. Well, evidently not, as you can tell by looking at the current discussion of the war on terror, which has been the leading topic for the last month. I mentioned that Nicaragua has now become the second poorest country in the hemisphere. What's the first, the poorest country? Well, that's, of course, Haiti, which also happens to be the victim of most U.S. intervention in the 20th century by a long shot, which has left it totally devastated. It's the poorest country. Nicaragua is second ranked in degree of U.S. intervention in the 20th century. It's the second poorest. Actually, it's vying with Guatemala. They interchange every year or two as to who's the second poorest, and they also vie as to which is the leading target of U.S. military intervention. We're supposed to think that all of this is some sort of accident, has nothing to do with anything that happened in history, maybe. The worst human rights violator in the 1990s is Colombia by a long shot. It's also by far the leading recipient of U.S. military aid in the 1990s, maintaining the terror and human rights violation. In 1999, Colombia replaced Turkey as the leading recipient of U.S. arms worldwide. That's excluding Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. And that tells us a lot more about the war on terror right now, in fact. Why was Turkey getting such a huge flow of U.S. arms? Well, if you take a look at the flow of U.S. arms to Turkey, Turkey always got a lot of U.S. arms. It's strategically placed, a member of NATO, and so on. But the arms flow to Turkey went up very sharply in 1984. That didn't have anything to do with the Cold War. I mean, Russia was collapsing. And it stayed high from 1984 until 1999, when it reduced and it was replaced in the lead by Colombia. What happened from 1984 to 1999? Well, in 1984, Colombia launched a major terrorist war against the Kurds in southeastern Turkey. And that's when U.S. aid went up, military aid. And this was not pistols. This is jet planes, tanks, military training, and so on. And it stayed high as the atrocities escalated through the 1990s. Aid followed it. The peak year was 1997. In 1997, U.S. military aid to Turkey was more than in the entire period, 1950 to 1983. That is the Cold War period, which is an indication of how much the Cold War has affected policy. And the results were awesome. This led to 2 to 3 million refugees, some of the worst ethnic cleansing of the late 1990s, tens of thousands of people killed, 3,500 towns and villages destroyed, way more than Kosovo, even under NATO bombs. And the United States is providing 80% of the arms, increasing as the atrocities increased, peaking in 1997. It declined in 1999 because once again terror worked, as it usually does, when carried out by its major agents, namely the powerful. So by 1999, Turkish terror, called of course counter-terror, but as I said, that's universal, it worked. Therefore, Turkey was replaced by Colombia, which had not yet succeeded in its terrorist war, and therefore had to move into first place as recipient of U.S. arms. Well, what makes this all particularly striking is that all of this was taking place right in the midst of a huge flood of self-congratulation on the part of Western intellectuals, which probably has no counterpart in history. I mean, you all remember it. It was just a couple of years ago. Massive self-adulation about how for the first time in history we are so magnificent that we're standing up for principles and values and dedicated to ending inhumanity everywhere and the new era of this and that and so on and so forth. And we certainly can't tolerate atrocities right near the borders of NATO. That was repeated over and over. Only within the borders of NATO, where we can not only tolerate much worse atrocities but contribute to them. Well, another insight into Western civilization and our own is how often this was brought up. Try to look. I won't repeat it, but it's instructive. It's a pretty impressive feat for a propaganda system to carry this off in a free society. It's pretty amazing. I don't think you could do this in a totalitarian state. And Turkey is very grateful. Just a few days ago, the Prime Minister, Ecevit, announced that Turkey would join the coalition against terror very enthusiastically, even more so than others. In fact, he said it would contribute troops, which others have not been willing to do. And he explained why. He said, we owe a debt of gratitude to the United States because the United States was the only country that was willing to contribute so massively to our own, in his words, counter-terrorist war, that is, to our own massive ethnic cleansing and atrocities and terror. No other country, all other countries kind of, they helped a little, but they stayed back. The United States, on the other hand, contributed enthusiastically and decisively, and was able to do so because of the silence, servility might be the right word, of the educated classes who could easily find out about it. It's a free country after all. You can read human rights reports, you can read all sorts of stuff, but chose to contribute to the atrocities, and Turkey is very happy to, they owe us a debt of gratitude for that, and therefore will contribute troops, just as during the war in Serbia, Turkey was very much praised for using its F-16s, which we supplied it, to bomb Serbia, exactly as it had been doing with the same planes against its own population up until the time when it finally succeeded in crushing internal terror, as they called it. And as usual, as always, resistance does include terror. It's true of the American Revolution. In fact, it's true of every case I know. Just as it's true that those who have a monopoly of violence talk about themselves as carrying out counter-terror. Well, that's pretty impressive. And that has to do with the coalition that is now being organized to fight the war against terror. And it's very interesting to see how that coalition is being described. So have a look at this morning's Christian Science Monitor. That's a good newspaper, one of the best international newspapers with real coverage of the world. They have the lead story, the front page story, is about how the United States, people used to dislike the United States, but now they're beginning to respect it, and they're very happy about the way the U.S. is leading the war against terror. And the prime example, in fact, the only serious example, the others are a joke, is Algeria. It turns out that Algeria is very enthusiastic about the U.S. war against terror. The person who wrote the article is an expert on Africa. He must know that Algeria is one of the most vicious terrorist states in the world and has been carrying out horrendous terror against its own population in past couple of years, in fact, for a